On October 20th, 1865, 6 long months after the Civil War had officially ended, a man stood on the gallows in Nashville, Tennessee. The great armies were silent, the soldiers paroled and sent home to rebuild their shattered lives. But for this man, there would be no peace. He wasn't being hanged for treason. He was charged with 53 counts of murder. He was a supposed Confederate soldier, yet he was being treated like a common criminal, a monster beyond pardon. What did this man do that was so terrible, even by the brutal standards of war, that forgiveness was impossible? To understand the blood that was spilled, you must first understand the land that soaked it up. The Cumberland Mountains, straddling the border of Kentucky and Tennessee, were a world unto themselves in 1861. This wasn't a land of grand plantations or bustling cities. It was a rugged, isolated quilt of misty hollows, dense forests, and winding rivers, a place where the mountains themselves dictated the terms of life. The people here were as tough and unyielding as the rock beneath their feet, forged by hardship and bound by codes older than the nation itself. Their loyalties were not to distant governments in Washington or Richmond. They were to family, to kin, to the neighbor who helped you raise a barn, or the one you shared a long, simmering feud with over a property line. Here, personal honor was everything, and a grudge could be passed down through generations like a family heirloom. It was a place of deep faith and fierce independence, where the law was often just a suggestion and real justice was handled face to face. When the Civil War came, it didn't arrive like a disciplined army marching in formation. It seeped into these hollows like a poison, turning the very fabric of this society against itself. The conflict wasn't about slavery for most of these mountain folk. It was about loyalty, and it split communities with a surgical cruelty. Friend turned against friend, cousin took up arms against cousin. A dispute over a stray hog from 10 years prior could now be settled with a rifle, all under the banner of Union or Confederacy. Into this cauldron of simmering hate stepped 2 men who would become the living symbols of this brutal, personal war. One was Samuel Champ Ferguson, a man with a temper as sharp as his knife, who would side with the Confederacy. The other was David Tinker Dave Beatty, a staunch Unionist, as rugged and determined as his rival. They weren't generals or politicians. They were neighbors, products of the same mountains, who would soon become mortal enemies. This, then, was the world that was lost. It was a hard world, a violent world, but it had its own order. The people of the Cumberland Plateau stood to lose more than just a war. They stood to lose their homes, their families, and the unwritten laws that had governed their lives for a century. They were about to become the victims of a war fought not on battlefields, but in their own backyards, by their own people. There was no single crime scene cordoned off with yellow tape. In the borderlands of 1861, the crime scene was an entire mountain range. The first shots of Champ Ferguson's personal war weren't fired on a battlefield, but in a secluded clearing, witnessed only by the silent, ancient trees. The first report of the crime didn't come from a sheriff, but from the whispers that snaked through the hollows, carried on the wind like a bad omen. The most verifiable story begins with a capture. A group of local Unionists, led by a man named William Frog, cornered Ferguson and his friend Preston Smith. This was not a formal military arrest. It was a kidnapping, an act of personal power in a land where badges and uniforms meant less than the name your family carried. They were dragged to a makeshift camp, a place where the only law was the will of the man holding the gun. There was no trial, no charge read, just the cold, hard glint of hatred in Frog's eyes. The scene that unfolded was one of stark, summary brutality. Frog, acting as judge, jury, and executioner, declared Preston Smith an enemy. Before anyone could process what was happening, he raised his pistol. A single shot echoed through the hollow, and Smith fell dead to the ground. In that instant, Champ Ferguson, bound and helpless, watched his friend be murdered not for a cause, but for a conviction. He saw the grim satisfaction on Frog's face and understood that the rules of civilization no longer applied here. The only evidence left at the scene was a fresh grave, if they even bothered to dig one, and the memory of the man who got away. In a desperate surge of adrenaline, Ferguson broke free. He scrambled into the dense woods as bullets tore through the bark around him, a ghost in motion, fueled by pure terror and a dawning, white-hot rage. The tracks he left were not of a soldier retreating, but of an animal escaping a trap, an animal that would soon learn to become the hunter. This singular, brutal event was immediately tangled with other, even darker whispers. Stories began to circulate about a different kind of crime scene at Ferguson's own cabin. People said that Unionist home guards had come for him while he was away, finding his wife and young daughter sick in their beds. The tale, told in hushed tones, claimed the men forced the ailing women out into the freezing cold, an act of such profound cruelty that they soon died. Was it true? Or was it a legend that grew from the seed of Preston Smith's murder? The wilderness offered no easy answers, only a multitude of unsettling questions that all pointed to one terrifying certainty. A reckoning was coming. When the storm of violence finally broke, it wasn't a random tempest. It was a targeted lightning strike. The first suspects in Ferguson's war, the first men he hunted, were not strangers in blue uniforms from a distant northern state. They were his neighbors. They were the men he held personally responsible for shattering his world. His rage had a face and a name, and at the top of that list were William Frog and Tinker Dave Beatty. The motive was as clear as a mountain stream and as dark as a grave. Everyone in the borderlands knew the story of Preston Smith's execution. William Frog hadn't just killed a Confederate sympathizer. He had murdered Champ Ferguson's friend in cold blood right before his eyes. The image of his friend falling, the puff of gun smoke in the cold air, the casual cruelty of the act. It was a wound that could only be cauterized with blood. This was a debt of honor, and in the mountains, such debts are always paid in full. Layered over this undeniable act was the even more potent legend of his wife and daughter. Whether the story of the Unionist home guards forcing them from their sickbeds was entirely true, or a tale that grew larger in the telling, doesn't matter. Ferguson believed it. He carried that story in his heart like a burning coal, a narrative of unimaginable cruelty that justified any atrocity in return. He saw Tinker Dave Beatty's men not as soldiers, but as monsters who had preyed upon the helpless and desecrated the sanctity of his home. The whispers that followed Ferguson as he slipped back into the mountains were not of strategy or politics. They were of a vow. He made no secret of his intentions. He told anyone who would listen that he was on a mission of vengeance. He swore an oath that for every friend, for every family member lost, 100 Yankees would pay the price. The initial evidence of his coming rampage was his own chilling declaration of a war of extermination, a promise to hunt down and kill every last man he held accountable, giving no quarter and taking no prisoners. The borderlands were no longer a battleground, they were his personal hunting ground. But Ferguson's rage, as potent as it was, did not burn in a vacuum. A fire that big needs fuel, and it needs air. While his enemies gave him the spark, it was the people he considered allies, his own neighbors, and the very cause he fought for, who fanned the flames. This introduces the second, more insidious suspect in the creation of this monster, the quiet poison of internal betrayal. Ferguson became a weapon, but the hands that aimed him often belonged to his friends. No one suspected the motives of the Confederate-leaning families who offered him shelter, food, and information. They were seen as patriots supporting a local hero. But beneath the surface, older, more personal currents were at play. A long-standing land dispute, a family insult from a generation ago, simple jealousy. These were the true motives that often guided Ferguson's hand. A farmer would ride to his camp, not with news of troop movements, but with a whisper that his Unionist neighbor, the one who owned the fertile bottomland he'd always coveted, was a dangerous bushwhacker. When re-examined, the pattern of his killings suggests a darker truth. Why was Elam Huddleston, a sickly old man, a priority for execution? Because someone in the community declared him a very bad man. Ferguson, consumed by his own mission of vengeance, was the perfect tool. He didn't need much proof. A pointed finger from a supposed ally was enough. He became the physical manifestation of his community's petty hatreds, settling their private scores under the public banner of the Confederacy, perhaps without even realizing he was being used. This betrayal extended all the way to the top. The Confederate government in Richmond was happy to have men like Ferguson terrorizing the Unionist population, disrupting supply lines and tying down troops. They gave him legitimacy, a captain's commission, a flag to fly. But it was a relationship of convenience. They wanted the chaos he created, but they kept him at arm's length, officially disavowing his most brutal tactics. They betrayed the very guerrilla fighters they empowered, using them for the war's dirtiest work and leaving them to face the consequences alone. Ferguson thought he was a soldier, but to many on his own side, he was just a rabid dog, to be unleashed on their enemies and put down when he was no longer useful. But beyond the personal hatreds that festered in the mountain hollows, a larger, more impersonal storm was gathering. This threat came from outside the tight-knit world of the borderlands, an organized force that saw these hills not as a collection of homes and families, but as a strategic chessboard. This was the formal war machine of the United States and the Confederacy, and its arrival would pour gasoline on the fires of local feuds. To the Union High Command in Nashville and Washington, Champ Ferguson was not a grieving husband or a man avenging a friend. He was simply a problem to be solved, an infection of rebellion in a strategically important region. Their motive was cold, calculated, and entirely impersonal. Pacify the area, protect Union supply lines, and eliminate all irregular resistance. They sent patrols of uniformed soldiers, men who didn't know the local families or their histories. To these outsiders, a man plowing his field could be a farmer or a guerrilla fighter in disguise. They often couldn't tell the difference, and their harsh methods bred even more resentment. From the other direction, the Confederate leadership applied its own external pressure. They saw in Champ Ferguson not a man, but a weapon. His personal vendetta was a useful tool for terrorizing Unionist sympathizers and disrupting federal operations, all at little cost to the formal Confederate Army. They gave him a captain's commission, a thin veneer of legitimacy for his bloody work. Men like General John C. Breckinridge were happy to use Ferguson's savage band of riders for a specific military objective, like the attack on Saltville, and then look the other way when the butchery began. Ferguson was their asset, a wild dog they could point in the right direction, whose savagery served their larger, impersonal goals. The presence of these organized armies created a new climate of fear, squeezing the people of the mountains in a terrible vice. Suddenly, strange men in uniform were a common sight on the winding roads, carrying an air of official, indifferent menace. They brought with them a different kind of violence, organized, efficient, and absolute. The personal war of neighbor against neighbor was now caught up in a national conflict, escalating the stakes beyond anything the locals could have imagined. This external pressure crushed the old rules of the mountains, leaving a vacuum where only the most brutal could thrive. The hunt for Champ Ferguson began in earnest, a desperate attempt to cage the monster that had been unleashed. The primary hunter was his arch-nemesis, Tinker Dave Beatty, a man who knew the mountains as well as Ferguson did. He was joined by patrols of Union cavalry, professional soldiers sent to bring order to a land that had never known it. They had a clear target and a righteous cause. But they soon discovered they weren't hunting a man. They were chasing a phantom. Every lead they followed seemed to dissolve into the Appalachian mist. A farmer would ride breathlessly into a Union camp, swearing he'd just seen Ferguson and his men watering their horses at Calfkiller Creek. A posse would be formed, riding hard for hours through treacherous terrain, only to arrive and find nothing but hoof prints fading in the mud and the cold ashes of a long-dead campfire. Ferguson was a master of the wilderness. He knew every hidden hollow, every game trail, every cave that could shelter a man from a storm or a patrol. The mountains that were a confusing, hostile maze to the outsiders were his sanctuary. The Union soldiers operated on the assumption that they were fighting a guerrilla company. They looked for camps, for supply lines, for patterns. But Ferguson fought by no book of military tactics. He and his small band of riders would materialize on a remote road, carry out an execution, and then vanish, melting back into the forest as if they were never there. They would ride 30 miles in a night, split up, and rendezvous days later at a prearranged spot known only to them. Tracking them was like trying to track a dozen individual wolves at once. One promising report placed Ferguson at a sympathizer's farm, preparing for an evening meal. A full company of Union soldiers surrounded the property in the dead of night, moving with painstaking silence. They burst into the cabin at dawn, ready for a firefight, only to find the farmer's family calmly eating breakfast. The farmer would claim he hadn't seen Ferguson in months, his face a perfect mask of innocence. The soldiers would leave empty-handed and furious, never knowing that Ferguson had been watching them from a wooded ridge the entire time, warned hours earlier by a signal from a trusted neighbor. With every failed raid, every cold trail, the frustration of the Union forces grew into a palpable rage. And for the Unionist families living in those isolated hollows, that frustration translated into pure terror. They knew the soldiers couldn't protect them. They knew that Ferguson was always watching, and that the price for talking to the Federals was a visit in the night from which there was no return. The more the law failed to catch him, the more powerful his legend became, and the deeper the fear settled into the bones of the community. The Union Army quickly learned that the dense forests and rocky bluffs were not the most formidable obstacles in their hunt for Champ Ferguson. The true fortress that protected him was a silent, invisible wall built by the people of the mountains themselves. When soldiers came asking questions, they were met with blank stares, shrugged shoulders, and a maddeningly consistent refrain: saw nothing, heard nothing, knew nothing. This was the omerta of the Appalachians, a code of silence more binding than any law. This silence was rooted first and foremost in pure, paralyzing fear. Ferguson wasn't just a soldier, he was a specter of vengeance. He cultivated terror as a weapon. Stories, true or not, of his brutality were his greatest ally. He was known to decapitate his victims and leave their heads on fence posts as a grim message to others. A farmer who might have considered cooperating with the Union patrol knew that the soldiers would eventually leave. But Ferguson would remain. A whispered word to the wrong person could lead to a visit in the dead of night, a barn burned to the ground, or a fate far, far worse. But it wasn't just fear. It was a complex web of family ties and a deep-seated suspicion of outsiders. Ferguson was a local man. His kin and his wife's kin were woven into the fabric of the community. Turning him over to an army of strangers felt like a profound betrayal of their own blood. To many, the Union soldiers were an occupying force, invaders who didn't understand their ways, their feuds, or their loyalties. In the stark calculus of the mountains, it was often better to shelter your own monster than to trust the justice of a foreigner. This wall of silence took a heavy psychological toll. The air in these hollows grew thick with unspoken truths. Neighbors who had known each other for generations now avoided eye contact, their conversations becoming clipped and shallow, terrified of letting a dangerous word slip. Old Man Hemlock, who lived on the ridge overlooking the Calf Killer River, once mentioned to a traveling peddler that he'd seen riders pass his cabin late one night. A week later, he found his prize hog, his food for the winter, slaughtered in its pen. No one said a word, but the message was as clear as a gunshot in the night. In this world, the only thing more dangerous than Champ Ferguson's rifle was your own tongue. Silence had become the only armor they had left. For 4 years, the war had been the perfect cover for Ferguson's savagery. But in April of 1865, a piece of information more powerful than any army trickled into the Cumberland Mountains. It wasn't a secret whispered in a cabin or a clue found on a body. It was the news of General Lee's surrender at Appomattox. The Civil War was over, and with that single undeniable fact, the entire world shifted under Champ Ferguson's feet. The overlooked detail, the forgotten clue that broke the case wide open, was his own identity. For years, he had operated under the belief that he was a soldier, a commissioned captain in the Confederate Army. His killings, in his own mind, were acts of war. But the surrender stripped away that justification. The cause he fought for no longer existed. The government that gave him a commission was dissolved. Suddenly, his actions had to be re-examined, not as tactics in a guerrilla conflict, but as individual crimes. He was no longer a soldier. He was just a man who had killed, by his own count, over 100 people. The true turning point, however, was an act of profound arrogance on Ferguson's part. Believing his commission made him a legitimate combatant, he thought he was entitled to the same amnesty being offered to thousands of other Confederate soldiers. He made a fatal miscalculation. Instead of disappearing deeper into the mountains or fleeing west, he did the unthinkable. In May of 1865, he willingly rode into the Union-occupied city of Nashville and presented himself to the authorities to surrender and receive his parole. The moment he gave his name, the perception of the situation changed in a flash. The Union officers didn't see a weary soldier seeking peace. They saw a name from countless reports of atrocities. They saw the butcher of the Saltville massacre, the specter who had haunted the borderlands for 4 years. The forgotten clue, Ferguson's own wanted status as a war criminal, was no longer forgotten. Instead of a parole slip, they gave him iron handcuffs. The news of his capture was like a thunderclap across the mountains. The ghost had been caught. The boogeyman was in chains. And with that revelation, the wall of silence, which had been held together by fear, began to crumble. A new, desperate urgency took hold, not to find a killer, but to finally bear witness against him. The stories that had been buried in the dark soil of the Cumberlands for 4 long years were about to be unearthed. The climax of Champ Ferguson's story did not happen in a bloody mountain skirmish, but in the suffocating stillness of a Nashville courtroom in the autumn of 1865. The Phantom of the Cumberlands was finally caged, a physically imposing figure in the witness box, but his legend was about to be systematically dismantled, not by bullets, but by words. The central mystery was finally being addressed. Was this man a soldier, twisted by the horrors of war, or was he something else entirely? The trial would unmask him. The prosecution built its case brick by bloody brick. One by one, witnesses took the stand, widows, orphans, old men who had survived by some miracle. They didn't speak of battles or military objectives. They spoke of ambushes on lonely roads, of men shot down while pleading for their lives, of executions carried out with a terrifying calmness. They described Ferguson personally killing the sickly, bedridden Lieutenant Smith in a field hospital, dragging him from his cot and shooting him in the head. This wasn't war. It was murder. Then came the testimony that shocked a nation already numb to the horrors of the conflict. The Saltville massacre. Eyewitnesses, including Confederate officers, described the scene after the battle. They told the court how Ferguson and his men rode onto the field, ignoring the rules of surrender, and began a 2-day orgy of slaughter. They recounted watching him personally execute dozens of wounded and captured black soldiers from the 5th U.S. Colored cavalry, shooting them in their hospital beds and hunting them down in the woods. This act was so barbaric, it went beyond vengeance or military necessity. It was an act of pure, unadulterated hatred. But the final, definitive unmasking came from the mouth of Champ Ferguson himself. He took the stand, not with remorse, but with a chilling, defiant pride. He admitted to everything. He calmly confirmed the killings, one after another. His defense was simple and horrifying. He was a soldier, and these men were the enemy. When asked about killing the sick Lieutenant Smith, Ferguson coolly replied, "He was a bad soldier, and I wanted to get him out of the way." In that moment, the mask was gone forever. The journal, the letter, the forgotten clue, it was his own testimony. His motive was laid bare, and it was far darker than simple revenge. Vengeance may have been the spark, but the fire was fueled by something else, a cold, methodical enjoyment of power and death. He had appointed himself the ultimate arbiter of life and death in the mountains. The war had not created a monster. It had simply given a monster the perfect opportunity to flourish. The man in the witness box was not a soldier. He was a killer who had found his calling. Now that we know the verdict of the court, we can finally reconstruct the truth of those 4 terrifying years. We can push aside the rumors and legends and piece together the events, not as a soldier would tell them, but as the mountains themselves must remember them. For 4 years, the sound of a lone rider in the distance was enough to make a mother pull her children inside and bolt the door. A dog's frantic barking that was suddenly cut short was a sound that chilled the blood. Imagine a small makeshift hospital, a place of supposed sanctuary where wounded Union men lay shivering with fever and pain. Their war was over. The doors burst open, not with medics, but with Ferguson and his men. The doctor's pleas for mercy were met with cold silence. Then came the sounds, a series of muffled, ugly pops, one after another, each one followed by a final groan that was quickly silenced. A young lieutenant, sick with measles and no threat to anyone, was pulled from his cot. His bare feet scraped against the rough floorboards. Another sharp report echoed in the small room, followed by the heavy, final sound of a body hitting the floor. When the raiders left, an unnatural stillness filled the space, a silence more terrifying than any scream. Picture the scene at Saltville, Virginia. The formal battle was over. The Union forces, including the 5th U.S. Colored Cavalry, had retreated. But for the wounded and the captured left behind, the horror was just beginning. For 2 days, Ferguson rode across the field, a dark silhouette against a grey sky. From the surrounding hills, witnesses could hear the sporadic popping sound of his revolver over and over again. They saw wounded men, black soldiers who had fought bravely and surrendered, trying to crawl to the safety of the woods. The horsemen would follow. There would be another pop, and the crawling would cease. The battlefield, which had been a place of combat, became a silent field of execution, its fallen soldiers not casualties of war, but victims of a massacre. And then there were the personal encounters, the moments of intimate, face-to-face terror. An old man, Elam Huddleston, sickly and frail, stood before Ferguson, pleading that he was too weak to have ever been a threat. Ferguson's voice was flat, a pronouncement of fate. "You are said to be a very bad man." A single deafening crack sent the birds scattering from the trees for a mile around. Then there was only the sound of the rider's horse sighing as he turned to leave, leaving another dark stain on the Appalachian soil. This was the truth of Champ Ferguson's war. It wasn't fought on battle lines with cannons, but in sick rooms, on fields of surrender, and on lonely mountain roads, with a cold heart and a steady hand. The trial of Champ Ferguson wasn't held in some dusty mountain town courthouse where his name carried the weight of fear and legend. It was a formal military tribunal in Nashville, a public spectacle for a nation grappling with the war's savage legacy. The room was packed, the air thick with tension. Newspaper reporters from as far away as New York scribbled furiously in their notebooks, eager to capture every detail of the man they had already dubbed the Great Guerrilla Chieftain and the Confederate Demon. This wasn't just a trial for murder. It was an attempt to draw a line, to declare that even in the hell of a civil war, some acts were simply beyond the pale. Throughout the proceedings, Champ Ferguson was a figure of unnerving composure. As witness after witness took the stand to recount tales of cold-blooded slaughter, he watched them with a steady, unblinking gaze. He showed no remorse, no fear, not even a flicker of regret. He listened as men described him shooting the wounded in their beds, and his expression never changed. When it was his turn to speak, his defense was as simple as it was shocking. He claimed he was a soldier, a commissioned officer of the Confederacy. Every man he killed, he argued, was an enemy combatant in a war where the official policy on both sides of the border conflict was no quarter. In his mind, he was not a murderer. He was a patriot who had simply fought the war with more conviction than most. But the military commission was not swayed. The testimony was too damning, the victims too helpless, the cruelty too personal. They saw the clear pattern. This was not a soldier's work. This was a campaign of personal extermination, cloaked in the thin justification of a military commission. On October 10, 1865, the verdict came back. Guilty. The sentence was death by hanging. For most of the nation, the verdict was a moment of catharsis, a righteous judgment against one of the war's most notorious villains. Justice, it seemed, had been served. But back in the hollows of White County, Tennessee, on the good rebel soil where Ferguson had asked to be buried, the verdict was heard differently. To his family, his friends, and his sympathizers, he was not a war criminal. He was a soldier who had been martyred by a victor's court. They argued that Union guerrillas like Tinker Dave Beatty had committed similar acts and were now hailed as heroes. To them, Champ Ferguson wasn't hanged for his crimes. He was hanged for fighting for the Confederacy. The verdict, a clear-cut case of guilt in the eyes of the law, remains a subject of bitter debate in those mountains to this day, a perfect symbol of the brothers' war, where one man's monster is another man's hero. Champ Ferguson's death was not an end. It was a beginning. The beginning of a long and bitter memory that would coil itself around the lives of everyone he had ever touched. For his own family, the name Ferguson became both a curse and a martyr's cry. They buried his body in the good rebel soil he requested, but they could not bury his legacy. For generations, his descendants would carry the weight of his actions, forced to live in the shadow of a man remembered by half their neighbors as a monster, and by the other half as a hero betrayed. His name was a burden, a mark that set them apart in the very hills they called home. And what of his great rival, Tinker Dave Beatty? He had won. He had outlasted his nemesis and fought for the victorious side. But victory in a war like this is a fragile, haunted thing. Beatty lived a long life, but the brutal tactics he had been forced to adopt, the friends he had lost, and the constant threat he had lived under for 4 years left scars that no government pension could heal. He had survived the devil himself, but the fight had cost him a piece of his own soul. Peace in the mountains was a quiet, uneasy thing, and for a man like Beatty, the silence was likely filled with the ghosts of the war he had fought and won. For the families of the men Ferguson killed, his execution was a final, terrible chapter. It was justice, but it was not restoration. It could not bring back a husband, a father, or a son. They now had to live in a fractured community, walking the same roads and frequenting the same general store as the very people who had sheltered Ferguson, who had fed him, who had kept silent while he hunted their loved ones. The immediate threat was gone, but the sense of betrayal remained, a quiet, simmering poison that would taint relationships in those hollows for decades. The lives of those falsely accused, or those whose only crime was loyalty to the Confederacy, were also irrevocably altered. Many who had sympathized with Ferguson, who saw him as their protector, now bore the stain of his crimes. Their reputations were tarnished by association. They were the neighbors of a convicted mass murderer, a label that the victorious Unionists would never let them forget. Ferguson's execution only hardened their bitterness, cementing a sense of grievance that would be passed down to their children and their children's children, fueling the simmering resentments of the lost cause. The war was over, but the battle lines in the hearts of the people were now drawn in stone. The story of Champ Ferguson did not end on the gallows, and it wasn't sealed in his tomb. If you travel today to the France Cemetery in White County, Tennessee, you can still find his grave. It is a simple, weathered stone, a quiet place that belies the violent life of the man buried beneath it. This patch of earth is the most tangible remnant of his story, a physical anchor point connecting our world to his. You can stand there and look out at the same rolling hills he once rode through and feel the chilling presence of the past. The mountains themselves have not forgotten. The Calf-Killer River still flows, its name a permanent grisly reminder of the frontier violence that shaped this land long before the Civil War. The fog still clings to the hollows where he and his men would disappear, and the winding roads they used for ambush are still there, many of them now paved over, but following the same treacherous paths. The landscape of the Cumberland Plateau is a silent monument, etched with the memories of every skirmish, every execution, every desperate flight from justice. But the true echoes are not in stone or soil, they are in the whispers and the stories. To this day, the tale of Champ Ferguson is told in the borderlands, a local legend as potent as any ghost story. It's a story told around hunting campfires, a cautionary tale passed from grandfathers to their grandsons. They still talk about the myth of his missing head, the ghoulish rumor that his skull was taken for scientific study, a final indignity for the man who had terrorized their ancestors. Most powerfully, the war over Champ Ferguson's soul continues to this day. Walk into a local diner or hardware store in that part of the country and ask if he was a hero or a monster. You will start an argument that is just as passionate and divided now as it was in 1865. The world has forgotten, but these mountains remember. They remember because the war he fought was not just about North and South, it was about them. And that memory is now a part of their very identity, a living echo of a time when the devil himself rode the hills of Tennessee. So we return to where we began, to a man on a gallows in Nashville, long after the cannons of the Civil War had fallen silent. We asked what this man could have done that was so terrible, even by the standards of that brutal conflict, that he alone could not be forgiven. And now we have the answer. It wasn't that he killed, for the war had made killers of thousands. It was that he savored it. He stripped away the pretense of military necessity and revealed the cold, hard core of personal hatred. He murdered the sick, executed the surrendered, and turned a national conflict into his own private slaughterhouse, all while claiming the mantle of a soldier. Forgiveness was impossible because Champ Ferguson forced a nation exhausted by death to look at his work and finally draw a line between the horrors of war and the acts of a monster. This is a story, then, not just of a single violent man, but of a timeless and terrifying truth. It is a warning of what happens when the poison of personal vengeance is given the legitimacy of a flag and a uniform. It shows how the grand, abstract ideals of a nation at war can be twisted to justify the most intimate and brutal acts of neighbor against neighbor. And it is a profound lesson in the power of silence, how a community bound by fear and a complex code of loyalty can become the soil in which such evil is allowed to take root and grow, unchecked, until it consumes everything. The war is over. The men who fought it are long gone. But the ghost of Champ Ferguson and the questions his life demands of us still haunt those misty Appalachian hollows. He reminds us that the most dangerous battleground is not in a field or a fortress, but in the human heart, where the lines between soldier and murderer, justice and revenge, can blur and then vanish with terrifying ease. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story, or at least as much of it as the court records and old tales are willing to give up. The rest belongs to the mountains.